You know that point in Monopoly, like when someone has hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place and the rest of the board is just rolling the dice,
Yeah.
praying they don't land on a space that just completely bankrupts them?
Oh, yeah. The game technically isn't over, but I mean, the math has basically already decided the winner.
Right, exactly. People are still, moving their little pieces around the board, but the underlying math has spoken. The monopolies have been built.
And nobody wants to play that out.
Right. Well, according to a rather controversial document we're looking at today, the 2026 college football season is basically already over. The monopolies are built.
Hmm.
Today, you and I are tearing apart this source. It's the 2026 College Football Power Rankings from the Longhorns Nation podcast to see if the sport is truly rigged by a few massive powerhouses, or, if there's still a way for the rest of the country to flip the board.
Yeah, and examining this document today, Friday, June 26, 2026, with the season looming right around the corner, it gives us the perfect lens to evaluate the landscape for you. But we have to read between the lines here.
Right, because we aren't just looking at a list of teams.
Exactly. We are analyzing the underlying architecture of their arguments. Like, what specific mechanisms dictate who gets to be elite in 2026?
Okay, let's unpack this, because to do that, we really have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, right? The unapologetic Texas bias of this source material. I mean, it is the Longhorns Nation podcast.
Yeah, it's right there in the name.
Exactly. So we have to filter out the regional fanaticism to find the actual structural truths they're pointing out here. They start at the very top with what they label Tier 1, national championship favorites. Unsurprisingly, Texas is sitting at number 1.
I mean, of course they are.
Right. And the source justifies this by pointing to a completely elite roster, unparalleled recruiting, a defense that just gets faster every single year, and the massive suffocating expectations resting on the shoulders of quarterback Arch Manning. They explicitly state that Texas isn't just expected to compete for the SEC, they are expected to win it.
You know, that distinction right there is the dividing line of modern college football.
How so?
Well, competing means you string together some nice wins, you have a good season, everyone's happy. Expected to win, though, that implies a structural dominance. It means the infrastructure of the program is so incredibly robust that finishing second is viewed as a systemic failure, not just bad luck.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy. I want to look closely at the rest of this Tier 1 list because it really paints a picture of that infrastructure. Ohio State is at number 2, and the source highlights them for reloading with yet another 5-star quarterback and a roster packed with NFL talent.
Just endless depth.
Right. And then Georgia is at number 3, and the document literally describes head coach Kirby Smart and his staff as recruiting machines.
Which is pretty accurate, honestly.
Totally. Then we have Oregon at number 4, where Dan Lanning is praised for building SEC-level talent and playing highly physical football. And finally, Notre Dame is at number 5, noted for their sheer gravitational pull. They just consistently, force their way into the playoff conversation year after year.
What's fascinating here is the shared DNA of these Tier 1 programs, according to the source. It's not about having, a brilliant tactical scheme or catching lightning in a bottle with a veteran team.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It is strictly about systemic, machine-like talent acquisition. Think about what a 5-star recruit actually is. It's not just a shiny recruiting badge.
What is it then?
We are talking about mathematically rare physical anomalies, like 18-year-olds who possess the biomechanics, the speed, and the sheer mass of a 25-year-old NFL veteran.
That's terrifying, honestly.
Right, and Tier 1 programs are hoarding these anomalies. They don't rebuild when a star leaves, they simply swap out a part on the assembly line.
Yeah, it sounds less like a sports league and more like a Fortune 500 monopoly. It's as if these teams are massive, invincible corporations. If Ohio State or Georgia loses a star linebacker, it's like Apple or Microsoft swapping out a chief financial officer.
Exactly. The machine doesn't stop.
Right. The corporate infrastructure is so incredibly vast that the stock value doesn't drop a single dime. The new guy steps in, and the machine keeps printing money. But I have to push back on the source material's ultimate conclusion here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, if we accept this corporate monopoly metaphor, is Texas genuinely the undisputed number 1, or is this just pure Longhorns Nation optimism blinding them to reality? Because, look, Ohio State and Georgia have been running that specific Fortune 500 machine for a lot longer.
Yeah, you're identifying the exact moment their regional bias overtakes their own logic. The source's criteria for a Tier 1 program is structurally sound. You absolutely need that Fortune 500 roster depth to survive a modern season.
Right.
And it is empirically true that Texas has built that infrastructure, but ranking them above a Georgia or an Ohio State program that effectively invented the modern version of this machine, that is the fandom showing its hand.
Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch.
It is. However, notice the specific phrase they use to praise Oregon in this tier. They say Oregon is building SEC-level talent.
Oh, I caught that too. That is a wild geographical shift in how we talk about the sport. I mean, Oregon is in the Pacific Northwest, yet they are being measured by a southern yardstick.
Because the Southeastern Conference is no longer just a geographic league. In the minds of this source, it has become a descriptor of physical mass.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, it's the undeniable benchmark for measuring roster depth across the entire sport. If you want to sit at the Tier 1 table, you have to prove your defensive line possesses SEC-level dimensions.
So, if Tier 1 is Apple and Microsoft monopolizing all the raw materials and, setting the industry standards, what happens to the historically great companies that used to dominate the market? How do they survive?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. And that leads us perfectly into the source's Tier 2, titled Right Outside the Favorites. If Tier 1 is defined by machine-like perfection, Tier 2 is defined by the margin of error.
Yeah. In Tier 1, the margin for error is essentially non-existent. You can play a bad quarter of football and your raw talent just bails you out. But in Tier 2, the margin for error becomes painfully visible.
Let's look at the teams trapped here. We have Penn State. The source notes James Franklin has a tremendously talented roster, but, questions if they can consistently beat the absolute elite.
Always the hurdle for them.
Exactly. We have LSU, described as incredibly explosive and athletic on offense, but held back by the desperate need for a consistent defense. Clemson is here, quietly rebuilt by Dabo Swinney, dangerous, but perhaps no longer the terrifying dynasty of the late 2010s.
Right.
Miami is labeled the ultimate wild card, like possessing pure talent, but highly questionable consistency week to week. And then there is Alabama.
The commentary around Alabama in this document is incredibly telling about the psychological state of the sport right now.
It's almost jarring. The source asks, is Alabama back? But then they immediately redefine what the word back means. They claim that being back in 2026 merely means Alabama can compete with Texas, Georgia, and Ohio State rather than dominating everyone they play.
Right, which is a huge shift.
Huge. Imagine sitting there as an Alabama fan, a program that defined the sport for 15 years. Suddenly, being a top-tier contender is viewed as a massive demotion. I struggle with this logic. Has the standard for success fundamentally warped how we view these Tier 2 teams?
It's completely warped our perception. We have been conditioned by the Tier 1 monopolies to view anything less than absolute hegemony as a fatal flaw.
Yeah.
Think of Tier 2 teams like promising multi-billion-dollar tech startups. They have a revolutionary product like LSU's breathtaking, explosive offense or Miami's pure playmaking ability. But they have a terrible supply chain. They have a single point of failure. In boxing terms, it's a glass jaw.
Okay, but what does a glass jaw actually look like in a 60-minute football game against a Tier 1 machine?
It manifests as psychological desperation.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, if LSU knows their defense is going to give up points, their offense suddenly feels the pressure to score on every single possession. It changes the offensive coordinator's play calling. They take riskier shots. They abandon the run game early, and, they make mistakes.
I see.
When a Tier 1 team like Georgia plays Miami, they aren't trying to match Miami's explosive plays. They are just systematically poking and prodding until they find that glass jaw, that one inconsistent linebacker, or that one inexperienced offensive tackle.
And then they exploit it.
Exactly. Once they find it, they hit it relentlessly until the startup collapses under the pressure.
So if you have a glass jaw, you get exposed. And notice how many of the teams we just talked about are being measured entirely by their ability to survive the SEC.
This is a recurring theme.
It really is. That leads us directly to the source's Tier 3, which focuses heavily on teams trapped in the unforgiving meat grinder of SEC schedules. They call this group the playoff sleepers, but honestly, survivors feels like a better word.
Yeah, the concept of survival fundamentally alters how we evaluate these specific programs.
Let's dive into who is stuck in this group. Oklahoma is the first one mentioned. The document openly admits that Sooner fans will be furious about this placement. But they argue Oklahoma lacks consistency, and to quote the source, the SEC isn't forgiving.
They aren't wrong about that.
No, they aren't.
Yeah.
Ole Miss is next. The source acknowledges Lane Kiffin can scheme up an incredible offense against anyone, but questions if they have the physical mass to survive the schedule. Yeah. Texas A&M is fascinating to me. The source claims they never lack talent. It is purely an execution issue with them.
Having the raw materials of a Tier 1 team but constantly baking a Tier 3 cake has to be the most agonizing experience for a fan base.
Absolutely brutal. Then you have Florida, noted as improving, but the source bluntly states the SEC doesn't hand out victories for simply getting better. South Carolina is described as a physical, aggressive spoiler team.
They love that role.
They really do. And Tennessee is the classic enigma, right? Like, fully capable of beating a Tier 1 team on a Saturday night and equally capable of losing a game they have no business losing 2 weeks later.
Very true.
When I look at this cluster of teams, playing in the SEC sounds like being trapped in a crab bucket.
Yeah.
Every time a wildly talented team like Oklahoma or Tennessee tries to pull themselves up to the rim and break into that Tier 1 monopoly, a bruising, aggressive team like South Carolina reaches up and drags them right back down into the mud. So, what does this all mean for the listener who is trying to understand why these massive brands are stuck in the middle of the pack?
Well, if you look at the underlying logic of the text, success for this specific group of teams is no longer a conversation about raw athletic talent. We see that explicitly in their evaluation of Texas A&M.
Right.
In Tier 3, success is an exercise in weekly physical and psychological attrition. The document states, every Saturday feels like a playoff game. Let's break down the mechanics of what that actually does to a human body.
Yeah, walk me through it.
If you are an offensive lineman for Ole Miss or Oklahoma, playing in the SEC means you are colliding with 300-pound defensive tackles who run like linebackers week after week.
Just nonstop car crashes.
Exactly. By week 8, the biomechanics of your roster are fundamentally degraded. The footwork slows down by a fraction of a second. The psychological focus begins to fray because the central nervous system is just exhausted.
Wow.
These Tier 3 teams aren't sleepers because they lack the high-end talent to win a championship on paper. They are sleepers because they lack the Fortune 500 depth to replace those exhausted parts. They simply run out of armor before November ends.
That is a brutal reality. It's a literal war of attrition. But that raises a massive question. If the SEC is this bruising, bone-crunching environment that degrades even the most talented rosters, how on earth do teams outside of that geographic footprint build dangerous programs?
That's the real puzzle.
Right. If you aren't stockpiling 5-star recruits in the South, what is your path to relevance? The source answers this in Tier 4, and it comes down to choosing extreme discipline over flash.
The contrast between the teams in Tier 4 and the teams we just discussed is jarring, and it highlights a completely different philosophy of program building.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Tier 4 is called dangerous, but inconsistent. But look closely at the profiles the source builds for these teams. Kansas State is highlighted as one of the most fundamentally sound teams in the entire sport.
Yeah, they really are.
Iowa State is described as incredibly disciplined, highly competitive, never flashy, but wildly dangerous. You have Michigan in here, seemingly proving that replacing NFL stars isn't nearly as easy as Ohio State makes it look. Texas Tech is noted for building an interesting offensive fire, and BYU is marked as a heavily underrated program.
They also throw in Louisville, SMU, Auburn, and Missouri as programs that are climbing, right? Like recruiting well or slowly rebuilding.
Yes, exactly. It is an entire tier dedicated to programs that maximize their resources rather than hoarding them.
Right.
But I want to contrast the machine-like recruiting of Georgia in Tier 1 with the fundamentally sound approach of Kansas State and Iowa State here in Tier 4. The source frames these disciplined teams as inherently capped, dangerous, but never true favorites. I have a really hard time accepting that framing.
Why is that?
Well, is it actually possible for a highly disciplined, fundamentally sound team to break into Tier 1 and win the whole thing? Or is the talent gap, that Fortune 500 monopoly, just too mathematically wide in 2026?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the sports ecosystem, the role of these Tier 4 teams is vital, even if they don't lift the trophy at the end of the year. They act as the ultimate lie detectors for college football.
Lie detectors.
Okay.
Explain how that works on the field.
Think about the most fundamentally sound, disciplined person at your workplace. They might not be the flashy, visionary CEO who gets all the magazine covers, but they're the person who instantly exposes everyone else's sloppy mistakes because they do the boring things perfectly.
Oh, I know exactly who you mean.
Right. That is Kansas State. That is Iowa State. In an era of super athletes, being fundamentally sound means maintaining perfect gap integrity on defense. It means never missing a tackle in open space. It means flawless clock management.
Just doing the details right.
Exactly. Mathematically, it is increasingly improbable for them to beat a Tier 1 team fielding 22 future NFL starters. But if a Tier 2 team like Miami has a lapse in focus, or if a Tier 3 SEC team comes in battered and physically exhausted, these lie detectors will execute flawlessly and punish them. They dictate the playoff picture by exposing the fatal flaws of more talented rosters.
They strip away the hype. If your startup has a bad supply chain, Kansas State will find it and bankrupt you.
That's exactly it.
Speaking of hype, though, having evaluated all the pieces on this giant chessboard, the monopolies, the startups, the survivors, and the lie detectors, we have to turn to the source's final verdict. How does this Longhorns Nation podcast actually see the 2026 season unfolding?
Well, they set up their grand finale by posing the defining questions of the year, which actually serve as a perfect summary of the anxieties running through each tier.
Right. They ask, can Arch Manning live up to the massive hype? Will Ohio State reload one more time? Will Georgia stay Georgia? Will Oregon win the big games? Will Alabama prove the dynasty isn't over? And will Oklahoma prove they belong in their new neighborhood?
All great questions.
And then they drop the predictions. They have Texas winning the SEC. They have Ohio State taking the Big Ten, Clemson winning the ACC, and Kansas State winning the Big 12. But the ultimate prediction, the entire reason this document exists, is that Texas breaks through and wins the national championship.
There it is.
Right. The reasoning they give isn't just about statistics, though. They claim the roster, the coaching, and the confidence in Austin just feel different this year.
This raises an important question about the psychological weight of expectations. The author points out that Longhorns Nation has been waiting a very long time for this specific moment.
Oh, a very long time.
Yeah, and when an entire ecosystem expects a championship because you've successfully converged a Tier 1 roster with a generational, high-profile quarterback, how does that pressure physically alter the team?
It has to be suffocating, like just completely crushing.
It is a crucible. That level of championship or bust pressure either forges a diamond, creating a legendary season, or it crushes the program under the sheer weight of its own hype. The source neatly resolves all the tension it built up by simply assuming Texas will thrive in that pressure cooker rather than crack.
I mean, look, we have to call it what it is. A document titled The Longhorns Nation Podcast Predicting a Texas National Championship is literally the least surprising plot twist in the history of sports media.
Shocking, I know.
Right. It would be like an Apple keynote ending with the conclusion that you should buy an iPhone. But setting that undeniable fandom aside, I have to admit the structural logic they used to get to that conclusion is genuinely sound.
It really is.
If you accept their core premise, that Tier 1 is entirely defined by Fortune 500 talent hoarding, and you acknowledge that Texas has successfully hoarded that talent and paired it with Arch Manning's ceiling, the math checks out. It is a highly logical, if heavily biased, conclusion.
It is the textbook definition of motivated reasoning built on a foundation of empirical facts. Like, the talent evaluation is real, but the coronation is heavily projected.
So, to pull all this together for you, 2026 college football, according to this deep dive into the source material, is defined by a very rigid hierarchy. You have an arms race of elite, corporate-like recruiters at the very top operating like monopolies in Tier 1.
Yeah.
You have incredibly talented but fatally flawed challengers operating like risky tech startups in Tier 2. You have the brutal weekly physical attrition of the SEC crab bucket in Tier 3. And you have the highly disciplined, fundamentally sound lie detectors waiting to ruin everyone's season in Tier 4. It's a fascinating ecosystem that perfectly explains how the sport operates today.
It absolutely is. But staring at this very rigid structure leaves us with a lingering, almost uncomfortable reality to consider.
Okay, what is that?
If Tier 1 is now entirely defined by this machine-like corporate talent hoarding, and teams like Kansas State are firmly relegated to Tier 4 despite executing perfect fundamentals and extreme discipline, what happens to the soul of college football?
That's a big question.
Right. If the gap between having 5-star genetic anomalies and executing perfect fundamentals becomes mathematically impossible to cross on a Saturday afternoon, is the sport simply becoming a game that is won in the boardrooms on signing day rather than on the grass?
Wow. That is a heavy thought to end on. I mean, if the Monopoly game is truly decided before anyone even rolls the dice, why do we keep watching? Well, I suppose we keep watching because every now and then, against all mathematical odds, somebody manages to tip over the board. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been incredible unpacking this with you.
Always a pleasure.
We will see you next time.
Yeah, yeah. throwing dirt, but the roots run deep. They keep losing sleep while we don't lose sleep, 'cause the